Well, firstly, thank you all for coming. Maud, it's great to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you.
This show, A Consequence Of, is the fourth iteration of a shifting body of work, the three previous iterations all having been presented in dedicated art spaces and galleries in Ireland. Here we see the work within the confines of a, modular, flexible theatre space with its own set of possibilities and limitations of light, space and movement. How did you negotiate those challenges, and how would you articulate the particular shading it gives to the current manifestation of your work?
Well, I think that as an artist, I like to embed a certain acrobatic flexibility in my work, and I think that within each piece there is a nuance and which speaks to individual spaces. It's as though that the space, because if you put something in space, it induces a third other element, and in the case of each place that it goes into, then it induces another kind of sensibility each place it goes. So I would have, as the body of work that I did titled A Consequence Of to begin with, I wanted to address the kind of accumulation and acceleration of consequence. And in some way, that is a very embedded and sort of complex, interwoven complexity of things, as we all know we're living in. And somehow it's becoming more and more accelerated. So I wanted to make work that somehow acted in a way to unlock some of the tension of that. Now, so that, if you like, that same unlocking, if you like, is something I like to try and bring about in each context. And I think that for me, the thrilling part and to a large extent really challenging part of this particular installation was that it was very contrary to what I was used to, because I was given a black space. Yeah. And I sort of went back to a comment by Samuel Beckett that he made in a review of Jack B. Yeats's paintings, and it's had sort of settled me a lot. And he was just talking about the kind of the darkness of the spirit, and how that Jack B. Yeats's paintings were sort of illuminations. And I think that that there is this kind of ever-ending metaphor of blackness feeding into the work all the time. In some ways I like to kind of, I get a sense of that as being a place from which my work comes to, as well as the actual pace of challenge in this context. But one of the other challenges I faced was that the inherent theatricality, and theatres are the most amazing spaces, because like cathedrals, they just absorb the recurrent performances and the sound. And I suppose that one of my first tasks was to come up with some way of creating a particular kind of stillness and muteness that I felt would be appropriate to my work. Slow down the space. Sure. So in order to slow down the space, I used I think it's because it was conceptually embedded in my work, a sort of filigree, a porosity, that I began to look at the idea of a translucent curtain. And in this case, I found a bobinette, which has a sort of slightly honeycomb. It looks a little bit honeycombed, which is a recurrent element of my work. So this idea that somehow this would filter the air, I liked the fact that it kind of embedded and controlled the air. And this, as a device, created a sort of situation which was, compatible in terms of the fire regs as well, which is important. But it kind of created a muteness. And as well, the team here, who were fantastic, allowed me to build these large walls here, which I think as well, that everything we did went up the full height. And because we did that, then it engaged the full space. And this is a beautiful proportion, this theatre. It reminds me of the Juilliard. Such a sweet theatre, such a fine space. And this is extremely sort of engaging in terms of sculptural endeavour, because it's both high and responsive to action, and also it is not so large that things get dissipated. But this particular space gave me the opportunity of inducing an interrelational install, you know, where it isn't just one piece in a room, but somehow that you evolve a language of interaction. And one of the most rewarding aspects of working with the team here was the fact that they were so nuanced in terms of lighting. So again, my concern was it would be too theatrical, because I didn't want my work to be too theatrical. And I liked the idea that somehow it emerged, it just kind of glowed in response to the flow of darkness. And so that we lit it kind of sensitively, so that it isn't kind of too high contrast, or maybe there isn't too much directional light. You'll probably notice that things are sort of a little bit glowy. This induced a kind of a sensitivity to the colour as well. So this was all possible because of the complexity and nuance of the lighting system. And I think I sort of tried to find a course of both using the language of theatre, but finding a particular sensibility that was about how one mediates the stillness of visual art.
Yeah, because there's the Bobbinet that Maud is referring to is this large screen here that one can walk behind, and it really mediates visually the whole sense of space. In some ways, it's almost a kind of a physical manifestation of the fourth wall, of a theatrical fourth wall. And then again, with the theatrical lighting, it gives the viewer, I think, a much different negotiating role than the viewer in a white cube, for example.
Yeah, and I quite liked the kind of psychological distancing. I mean, I always thought, you know, I like Ireland's weather because it's so foggy. You know, it's just so grey. Because sometimes you look out the window, you can't see what's going on with the amount of rain that's falling and so on. And like if you go to the sort of the coast where I was born, you're used to these mists that come in from the sea. And actually, the fact that it's so ambiguous suits me fine, because it allows my mind the kind of neutral space in which to think and work. And in some ways, there's a certain neutrality. If you go behind that curtain, you get a sense of distance, and you get a sense of the otherworldliness of the install.
That the way you talk about the mist there kind of brings me to my next question, which is, to my mind, your process reveals a particular kind of attentiveness to the objects and materials in the world around you. It's an attentiveness that is both quite restrained but also transformative, or to put it more simply, you seem to be simultaneously acting upon and leaving things be. Can you talk a little bit about how you negotiate this tension within your mode of attention?
Well, I suppose one has to address the object, and I think sculpture has a task, and the task is to articulate a new sense of integrative being and thinking with matter. So I don't believe objects are separate material things, separate to the body. For me, we're in an integrative kind of system of coexistence, and that we need to find sustainable ways forward. So I think that this was a kind of a strong impulse in my work. I wouldn't have articulated like that, but when I started off, I was very interested in the energy in objects and the energy in landscape, and you know, I was sort of felt there was such a psychological energy in landscape. And I travelled quite a bit to investigate it, but I went more Northern European. I went up to Iceland and on into Grimsey Island. I remember one day sitting on a cliff in Grimsey Island, which is inside the Arctic Circle, but it's a nice little bit of drawing to get a fishing boat out of the Eyjafjörður and go right up and break into the Arctic Circle, and to sit there on a cliff. I felt, well, you know, I'm in such a good place here now, I better start thinking about the context of both European and American culture. And in some ways, you see, this rather abstracted idea that we're integrated in my early stages of my development seemed to be, to me, perhaps not really fitting in with the rational world as I was experiencing it. But as things evolved, I think that, you know, this interest, which has become deepened, and I found a language of articulating it, which is more to do with kind of forming a sense of consciousness, a sustainable and collaborative relationship with material, which I think is absolutely necessary going forward. So in terms of detail then, you know, I'm reminded of a book that Nancy Cartwright wrote, The Dappled World, and I was attracted to her ideas because she really sort of more or less said there is no supreme theory of everything. Sure. That the world and the physical reality of the world presents itself as both pockets of precision and great banks of abstraction at the same time. And the thing is that we seem to be kind of on a course of quantifying everything, where what my work is doing in its detail and in a haphazard way, sometimes accidentally on purpose, bringing into play intangibles as well as very specific elements as well. Sure. And because that's the nature of physical reality. And so the nature of physical reality is something I think we have to re-examine. When you think about it, the world is full of you know, corporate junk. Yeah. We don't need most of it. And so if we begin to apply aesthetics and that sensitive and nuanced way of looking at things, I think it's a way forward. So in some ways, those kind of formal interactions, because it's about what form is. Wilhelm Flusset says that form is an amorphous stew, so physical reality is just an amorphous stew, and behind it are more abstract ideas which generate form itself, and that we can get to this by theory. But of course, being a visual artist, I think we can get to it through actual making, and through material, through how we view, understand, and use material.
And it seems you also get to it by simply by how you deal with the work in the spaces. I remember when you were speaking about this installation at the beginning of the show, you were talking about placing some of these objects here and deciding to use your foot to move some of them as well, to, you know, try and find different ways of engaging with the object, but letting it also have a kind of a volition of its own. It's liability to fall, or letting something fall, or letting something stand the way it is.
Well, it wasn't so much my foot, but this one in particular, weirdly and absolutely, of course, you know, I when I was placing it with my hand, somehow the pieces retained the tension of my hand, and it just wasn't working. And I discovered that if I got a handle of a brush and just kind of... That's what it was, yes. Yeah, I just whirled it around like that somehow it spun, and then in its kind of spinning, I could induce it to land in a particular place. Yes. So sometimes the more abstract aspects of material behavior, the agency in matter, one creates situations where you invite it to become part of what you do. And I sometimes feel that presence enters the work, as one can induce, and you can kind of strategize how to bring presence in. But the fact of the matter is it appears, it just kind of becomes concrete, it becomes part of it. And then once I've captured that sort of level of engagement, I move forward in it. Am I answering the question?
I think so.
Yeah, but so yeah, but the thing is, I like to engage with the agency of matter. I don't like to impose myself too much on it, so that it's very much a collaborative aspect, you know, the way things emerge. And sometimes I feel that what I bring to it, you know, there's certain porosity in some of the work. It becomes possible for it to mesh with something emergent, so that, yeah, there's a sort of courtship. You know.
You mentioned complexity, and you also use the term emergent, and that's interesting because the critic Ed Kurzma has used the term emergent complexity in relation to your work, and we can see the complexity at play in a piece like this, or again in a piece like this, but it's complexity of quite simple materials in some shape or form. How do you feel about that tension between the complex and the simple in your work?
Well, interesting enough, I think the most complex pieces are come into being through the simplest of gesture. In these cases, there's just a simple folding, but that it is the generative power and the propagative power of the object becomes sort of part of the thematic through the fact that I introduce many of them. So they become active as a group, and then that creates a sort of complexity and it creates a density. But if you don't start with a very simple gesture, you get lost. And sometimes the essentialness, for example, in a space like this, entering a line into a space like this is a single gesture, but it induces banks of tension on either side of it, so that it creates itself quite a complex situation. I think this was a primary thing I noticed when I started out as a sculptor, which drew me to line as being an essential instrument. And that was when I recognized that a vertical line has a great sense of aspiration and verticality. And once you tilt it one way or the other formally, such a level of complexity begins, you know. So I think that part of the challenge is to work the complexity so that it flows onwards, so that it moves. It's not incarcerated by you and how you handle it. So sometimes, you know, it's a case of kind of, I suppose, harnessing the energy that you induce to be formed by sometimes simple gesture.
I think we were talking earlier as well about this, with regard to this idea of complexity, about almost a kind of a social or political dimension to the idea of complexity. You know, there's so much in our political sphere right now that seems to lean towards simplicity, you know, just like simple dichotomies of right and wrong, or left and right, or red versus blue, or uselessness versus usefulness, in a very kind of instrumental way. Do you feel that is that something you're conscious of in the work as an undertone, or perhaps an overtone?
I mean, it's a challenge to every artist to justify the fact that to use space, materials, matter, resources, and how does it contribute to the world and the difficulties that we're all facing at the moment with the kind of multi-layered of increasing complexity. But I think, I like to think that like when I was making Without Stilling, I was very aware of that one had to build a system that was inherently tolerant, that other people could handle, that could be stored and could come forward, that, you know, had all these kind of nuances and differences, you know, that I didn't machine cut it. We made it by hand. I had a team working with me, and each piece was cut. That sort of meant that there was attention to detail, and that the particular meant that the larger form and expression somehow was fine. And like, so I was thinking of the European Union when I was making it. Sometimes I find myself thinking of the decision-making processes, that if there were more tolerances in it, and I suppose now there's a challenge in terms of accepting Moldova and Ukraine as new members. And because it has to be unanimous decision-making, that causes a kind of stress to the system. Will the system prove itself to be flexible enough for the new realities? And so I was very interested in this idea that some of the more incarcerated ways of behavior, I think, are really people just turning their back on the fact that things have changed utterly, that we cannot continue to behave in this way, that we have to realize that we're not, what we do, we're not masters of our situation, that we have to work more collectively and more collaboratively, both with animate and inanimate material and in our relationships. And the other thing I think that sculpture really teaches me, which it's not so much the object. It's the relational aspect. It's the relational spaces between things are really the most incredibly formative aspects of this. And I think people have been very object orientated in a very negative, limited, quantifiable way. And so what I'm doing in my work is saying there are spatial aspects and relational aspects and flexibilities and nuances that are worth taking on as values, and how because it's all about form, making form, and everything to do with politics is a shaping. And culture can sometimes teach us, by keeping this flexible space open, hopefully there might be some way of contributing, because obviously one can only contribute to perhaps the idea of a more open, flexible space and a new consciousness that does mean that we understand that our will is an enactment within a whole form of agency, none of which we actually control. And that's kind of a nuanced, and there is a tendency for people to think that because we lose our autonomy, that somehow we lose ourselves, but I don't think that's the case. I think that it's a very rewarding condition to be in, and one that's more relevant to how we view time, how we view future progress.
Interesting. To just change gears a little bit, these set of shows have drawn upon poetry and literature, both in the titles of the shows and the titles of the works. This, to me, gives the movement between the shows an almost kind of linguistic character, as in we're not seeing just a simple travelling exhibition, we're seeing an artist speaking, articulating and iterating, but also, as you go along, qualifying and querying and ultimately questioning. How do you understand the relationship between material and language in your work?
Well, I was working on a project recently, and I won't go into too much detail because it would just take up too much time. Suffice to say that I couldn't make it work until I got the right word, and the word I chose was karam. And this was a library which was in response to, or not so much in response, inspired by the life of David Cunningham, who was an architect who was involved with artists and who died rather tragically. And so the idea was to come up with an idea to use his books. And I didn't want to make a library that was commemorative. So the idea of karam meant that, like, karam is a word that it means that, like in billiards, it means a ball that moves forward and strikes a whole host of other balls and creates a new reality. That there's a dynamic of using the material that's in a library, which will become a composite of other people's minds, because it's a kind of a library of portraits in a condensed form. That will create a dynamic. So the word itself creates a territory and a dynamic through which ideas karam, actually, you know. So I've always been very drawn to the more acoustical and abstract sense of words, and something that's come along with my work all the way. Because this body of work, of which this is a selection, but I kind of started 5 years ago, and I chose A Consequence Of as a canopy title. And literally it formed itself in such a way that it allowed me to gather under its canopy. And then for each venue I had put, for example, down in Limerick, Without Stilling, because it's particularly looking at form as the question of what constitutes form, what are the characteristics of form, why is it important, etc. And the next one then I called A Breather of Air, because it was about human consciousness and the place of that. And the final one I called A Dappled World, because it was really dealing with some of the things I've been talking about earlier. When I came here then, I felt I'd strip away the secondary titles and just do A Consequence Of, because it was about the consequence and the act of being able to, thankfully through Culture Ireland, bring my work to New York, and the very action of doing that had inherent in it a consequence for me. And thankfully, as a result of being invited and having the opportunity to show here and to interpret this very exciting space, something else has happened as a consequence of that, that I've been invited to Museum of Contemporary Art to do a new piece. And so there's a certain dynamic, you know, words are very important.
And is there a title to that show?
What Was Never Ours to Keep.
I wanted to ask you about colour. The quite dramatic lighting here in this theatre space, I think, has given me certainly a renewed appreciation of your colour palette, and perusing the drawings also, which we can see out in the other parts of the space. It leads me to think a little less about the tensile, three-dimensional aspects of the work, and a little bit more about the interplay of colours and surfaces. How do you think about colour in your work, or have you the ways you've thought about colour, has that changed over the years?
Fortunately, I did Joseph Alber's Interaction of Colour when I was a student, and I fell in love with that kind of, you know, it creates a perceptive, it's lovely watching people walking by cars and watching them change colour when you're that sensitive, because it creates that level of sensitivity, and everything is relative. As I went on, then I sort of began to, it's really the frequencies. It's like, it's rather like the way I think of objects as well. I think of them as having different frequencies, and therefore I also think of colour having that. So it's a case, it's like you charge up an object by virtue of the colour. It changes the whole spatiality, because obviously form comes into action when light hits the colour. You know, so the colour disperses the interiority of the object so quickly. So it's a delivery of something. So if you decide you have a line and you decide to do it a fluorescent orange, it delivers into space in a different way. It actions the space differently. Yeah, I mean, you have to get the right, for example, in this piece, which is called The Moon is Falling, and this lower section is reminiscent of a sort of this kind of, which always reminds me a little bit of you. Sorry. It's just you. I remember you once said something about closed systems and open systems. Okay. And it's about the kind of fear of architecture becoming a closed, repetitive system.
Sure, okay.
So these elements are repeating. Yes. And the colour, because it's plastic, which is a ruinous and obnoxious material, it is describing a kind of layer, a dead layer of repetition, structurally dead, intellectually dead, repeating. But the strange thing about it is the colour is entertaining. And this is the horror of a lot of commercial goods. They're so entertaining, sure, but they're at heart ruinous. You know, so that's kind of, you see, I went for that colour there to provoke myself into making it work, if you know what I mean. Sure. The tension.
Maud, thank you so much for presenting these works and for being so articulate.